In a small town on the outskirts of Denver, Colorado, the streets were quiet, lined with little shops that looked the same as they had for decades. Among them sat Miller's Auto, a humble garage run by Ethan Miller, a 25-year-old mechanic with calloused hands and an honest heart. Business wasn't booming, but the townsfolk knew one thing for sure. If you went to Ethan, you were treated like family. He wasn't the type to turn anyone away, especially kids. Many remembered the times he had fixed their bicycles or scooters without charging a dime. For Ethan, it was never about money, it was about people. One particularly chilly afternoon, the sound of squeaky wheels echoed outside his shop. Ethan looked up from under the hood of an old Ford and saw a boy struggling to push himself forward in a worn-down wheelchair. The boy's name was Ryan Parker, only 10 years old, but his determined little face told a story of strength far beyond his years. His wheelchair rattled and wobbled, every movement looking painful. Behind him walked Sarah Parker, Ryan's 34-year-old mother, her steps slow, her shoulders weighed down by the burdens of life. She had been widowed 3 years earlier and had carried the weight of providing for her son ever since. That day, she carried something heavier than groceries. She carried worry. "Hello," Sarah said softly as she entered the garage, almost apologetically. She looked at Ethan with eyes that seemed to hold back both exhaustion and hope. "I heard you might be able to help us." His chair, "It's falling apart and we can't afford a new one. Maybe you could just make it last a little longer." Her voice wavered on those last words. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and knelt down beside Ryan, who was staring at the cracked wheels of his chair with quiet embarrassment. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said gently, smiling warmly. "Don't you worry. I'll take care of it." Ryan's eyes lit up just a little, though he stayed quiet, gripping the arms of his wheelchair as if afraid to let it go. Ethan noticed every detail: the wheels bent out of alignment, the brakes practically useless, the torn seat cushion that must have been uncomfortable. It wasn't just a machine that needed fixing. It was this boy's independence. Ethan glanced up at Sarah, whose lips trembled as she tried to smile. He could see she was holding back tears, and he realized this wasn't simply a request for help. It was a mother's desperate prayer. That evening, after Ethan had closed the shop and the streets grew silent, he didn't go home. He rolled Ryan's wheelchair into the center of his workshop and switched on the bright hanging lights. The chair looked small in the vast space, yet it demanded his full attention. Ethan set to work with the kind of focus usually reserved for life-saving operations. He tightened every loose bolt, replaced the wheels with sturdy ones from his own supplies, and carefully straightened the frame. Hours passed, but Ethan didn't stop. He remembered his own little sister, Anna, who had spent her last years in a wheelchair before passing away from illness when Ethan was still a teenager. Fixing this chair wasn't just about a stranger's son. It was about honoring Anna's memory, too. As midnight approached, Ethan's hands were stained with grease, but he wasn't finished. He added cushioning to the worn seat, repurposing old leather from a motorcycle seat he'd never sold. He wanted Ryan to be comfortable, not just mobile. He even polished the frame, restoring a shine that hadn't been there in years. Every detail mattered. When he was done, he stood back, chest rising and falling, and smiled faintly. The old wheelchair now looked nearly brand new, sturdy and safe, with just enough warmth to show it had been fixed with care. He whispered quietly to the empty shop, "That's for you, Anna." The next morning the sun rose over the small town, spilling golden light onto the pavement outside Miller's Auto. Sarah and Ryan returned, not expecting much. Sarah assumed Ethan might have tightened a few screws or oiled the wheels something simple to make it last a bit longer. But when Ethan rolled the chair out from the back, Ryan's jaw dropped. The boy stared at it as though it were some kind of miracle. The wheels gleamed, the frame sat straight, and the seat looked more comfortable than ever before. Ryan blinked rapidly, as if trying to believe his eyes. This can't be mine," he whispered, his small voice filled with awe. Ethan crouched down beside him, his own face glowing with quiet satisfaction. "It's yours, buddy. Go on, give it a try." Ryan hesitated only a second before sliding into the seat. His hands gripped the wheels, and for the first time in a long while, he rolled forward smoothly without squeaks or resistance. The chair glided across the floor like it was new. Ryan's face transformed as laughter burst out of him. A sound so pure that even Ethan had to chuckle. He wheeled himself around the garage in circles, grinning ear to ear, his voice echoing with joy. "It's perfect, Mom. Look, it feels brand new." Sarah stood in the doorway, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Tears filled her eyes, spilling freely down her cheeks as she watched her son's joy. For so long she had seen Ryan struggle with every push of those old broken wheels, and now here he was laughing, free, alive in a way she hadn't seen in years. She turned to Ethan, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You didn't just fix a chair, you gave my son freedom." She stepped forward and hugged him tightly, her gratitude pouring out in that single embrace. Ethan hugged her back gently, caught between the grease on his hands and the sincerity in her words. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man doing what was right. But in Sarah's tear-filled eyes and Ryan's laughter, he saw something much greater. In that small garage under the morning light, 3 lives intersected in a way none of them could have expected. It was the beginning of something that would ripple far beyond the little town, though none of them knew it. For Ethan, it was just one more act of kindness. For Sarah and Ryan, it was a miracle, and for Fate, it was only the first step in a much bigger plan. Word of Ethan's quiet act of kindness spread like wildfire through the small Colorado town. In diners, barbershops, and church pews, people whispered about the young mechanic who had repaired a boy's wheelchair for free. Some called it charity, others called it compassion, but to everyone it was remarkable. And to Ryan, it was more than that, it was life itself. He proudly rolled down the sidewalks in his new chair, showing neighbors how smooth it moved, how easy it was to turn, how different he felt. Everywhere he went, Ryan spoke Ethan's name with a smile too wide for words. Ethan, however, didn't think much of it. He wasn't one to bask in attention or expect praise. In his eyes, fixing that chair had been no different from repairing a broken chain on a kid's bicycle. It was simply the right thing to do. So while the town buzzed with admiration, Ethan kept working in his garage. Grease stains, the smell of motor oil, and the hum of old engines filled his days, the way they always had. He didn't realize that life had already shifted its course, carrying him towards something greater than he could have imagined. A few mornings later, the sound of a powerful engine approached the shop. Ethan glanced up, squinting at the sunlight reflecting off a sleek black SUV that rolled to a smooth stop outside. Its presence stood out sharply against the worn-down trucks and sedans of the neighborhood. From the driver's side stepped Daniel Hayes, a man of polished shoes and sharp suits, his salt-and-pepper hair neatly combed. At 52, Daniel carried himself with the authority of someone who had built an empire, and he was the CEO of one of the nation's largest medical equipment companies. Daniel had heard the story of Ethan and the boy's wheelchair through a mutual acquaintance who lived in town. Something about it had stirred him deeply. In boardrooms filled with figures and profit margins, he rarely heard stories of selflessness that weren't wrapped in corporate strategy. But this was different. This was a mechanic with little to spare, giving his time and resources freely to change a boy's life. Daniel's curiosity became action. That morning, he found himself standing in front of Miller's Auto, adjusting his watch before stepping inside the modest garage. Inside, Ethan was bent under the hood of a car, his hands working fast with a wrench. The clatter of tools and the faint sound of country music from a radio filled the air. When Ethan emerged, wiping sweat and grease from his forehead with a rag, his eyes fell on Daniel. The man didn't look like a customer, not with his tailored jacket and polished demeanor. Ethan straightened slowly, cautious but polite. "Morning," he said, his voice steady. Daniel stepped closer, his tone direct yet kind. "Young man, did you repair a boy's wheelchair for free?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yes, sir," he replied humbly, lowering the rag in his hands. He needed it, and his family couldn't afford the repairs. It wasn't much, but he deserved it. His words were simple, but his sincerity filled the room. Daniel studied him carefully, his sharp eyes softening as he realized Ethan wasn't the type to embellish or seek credit. Most people would have turned them away, Daniel said after a pause, his voice carrying weight. "But you didn't. That says a lot about who you are." At that very moment, fate seemed to orchestrate a scene. Sarah and Ryan happened to be nearby, walking past the shop on their way home from the grocery store. When Ryan spotted Ethan, his face lit up, and he wheeled himself quickly toward the garage. "Mr. Ethan!" he shouted, his young voice carrying pure joy. "He's the best mechanic ever!" His excitement filled the space, breaking the tension between the men. Sarah followed behind, smiling shyly at the sight of Ethan, the man who had given her son independence again. Daniel turned, observing the boy in the chair Ethan had rebuilt. The evidence was undeniable. Ryan glided smoothly, his movements effortless. The boy's admiration for the mechanic was genuine, his praise unprompted. It struck Daniel in a way numbers never had. Here was proof that kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways even the best machines couldn't measure. Daniel smiled faintly, then reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a simple white business card embossed with his name and company logo, extending it toward Ethan. "I think your kindness deserves something greater," he said firmly. "Let's talk." Ethan hesitated, staring at the card as though it were out of place in his grease-stained world. His fingers, smudged with oil, reached out slowly, taking it with uncertainty. Daniel Hayes. Hayes. "Medical?" he read aloud, surprised. He knew the name, everyone did. It was the company behind countless hospitals' wheelchairs, hospital beds, and in prosthetics. Ethan's brow furrowed. "Sir, I'm just a small-town mechanic. I don't know what you'd want to talk to me about." Daniel's lips curled into a small smile. "Exactly that. You see, people like you don't come around often, and when they do, they're worth investing in." Sarah's eyes widened as she overheard the exchange. She looked at Ethan with pride, her heart swelling at the thought of him being recognized for what he had done. Ryan, too young to grasp the weight of the moment, simply cheered. "See, Mom? I told you he's the best." Ethan stood quietly, conflicted. His life had been defined by long hours, worn-down cars, just enough money to scrape by. He never imagined that repairing one wheelchair could draw the attention of someone like Daniel Hayes. Yet here it was opportunity, knocking in the form of a sleek-suited CEO who believed in him. For a long moment, the shop was silent, except for the ticking of the car engine cooling behind Ethan. He glanced from Sarah to Ryan, then back to Daniel, his jaw tightening slightly as he searched for words. All he had done was help someone who needed it, something his father had taught him long ago. But maybe, just maybe, this act of kindness was meant to lead somewhere bigger. Ethan finally gave a slow nod, clutching the card carefully. "All right, Mr. Hayes," he said quietly. "Let's talk." Days later, Ethan found himself standing before the tall glass facade of a modern office building in downtown Denver. The structure was sleek, towering and intimidating, with polished steel beams reflecting the morning sun. He tightened, his grip on the strap of his worn leather bag, feeling entirely out of place among the sharp-dressed professionals rushing through the lobby. The scent of fresh coffee and the echo of heels on marble floors surrounded him. Taking a deep breath, Ethan reminded himself why he was there. This was more than just a meeting. It was the possibility of a new life. When he was led into Daniel Hayes's spacious office, Ethan's nerves only grew. The room was lined with bookshelves, framed awards, and architectural models of wheelchairs and prosthetic devices. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, giving the impression that this was where decisions that shaped the world were made. Across a mahogany desk sat Daniel himself, his expression calm, yet purposeful. He leaned forward, folding his hands together. "Ethan," he began, his voice steady, "I want you to work with us. You have skill, but more importantly, you have heart." Ethan blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Work? With you?" he repeated slowly. His jaw nearly dropped at the suggestion. He had never imagined leaving his tiny garage. Fixing cars had always been his way of surviving, not a stepping stone to something bigger, but now this man was offering him the chance to impact lives beyond anything he had ever dreamed. Daniel nodded, his tone warm but firm. "We design mobility devices for people like Ryan, and I could use someone like you on my team." The words struck Ethan harder than any paycheck could. He thought of Ryan's joyful laughter, the way Sarah had cried with gratitude. That single act had changed their world, and now it was changing his. His heart raced with excitement and fear all at once. "Sir," Ethan said carefully, "I don't have a degree. I don't have the kind of background people here must have." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his uncertainty. Daniel's eyes softened. "That doesn't matter. What you have can't be taught." Daniel leaned back, explaining further. "We'll cover your training. You'll learn everything you need to know, and you'll earn more than you ever dreamed of. But money isn't the point. What I saw in you, the compassion, the selflessness that's rare. We need that spirit here." Ethan sat, stunned, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the chair. His entire life, he had worked quietly, unnoticed, barely making ends meet, and now this opportunity, this door, was wide open before him. Memories flashed through Ethan's mind in rapid succession. His late nights in the garage, his father teaching him to use tools, his mother reminding him that kindness mattered more than wealth. He thought of Sarah's tearful hug, Ryan's joy, the card Daniel had placed in his hands days earlier. Everything had led to this moment, and he realized he couldn't walk away. Slowly, his lips curved into a determined smile. "If you'll have me, sir," Ethan said firmly, "I'll give this everything I've got." Daniel extended his hand across the desk. Then it settled. Ethan stood, shaking it with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. The CEO's grip was strong, steady, the kind of handshake that sealed not just a deal, but a promise. "All I ask," Daniel continued, "is that you never lose that kindness that brought you here. Machines and designs can be built by anyone, but heart? That's something unique." Ethan nodded firmly. "I won't forget where I came from, I promise." Later that evening, Ethan drove back to his modest town, his mind still spinning. The first people he wanted to tell were Sarah and Ryan, pulling up outside their small home. He barely had time to knock before Ryan rolled to the door, grinning from ear to ear. "Mr. Ethan!" the boy shouted. "Mom, he's here!" Sarah appeared. Moments later, her face lighting up when she saw him. Ethan crouched down, so he was eye level with Ryan. "Guess what, buddy? I'm going to be working with a company that builds wheelchairs for kids like you." Ryan's eyes widened with wonder before he launched himself forward, wrapping Ethan in a tight hug. "You're my hero!" he exclaimed, his small arms clinging with all the strength he had. Ethan's throat tightened, emotion welling in his chest. Sarah stepped closer, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You changed our lives." "Ethan, now it's your turn." Tears shimmered in her eyes, not of sorrow but of joy and gratitude. Ethan felt the truth of her words sink in. His life was about to change just as much as theirs had. From that day forward, Ethan was no longer just the small-town mechanic struggling to keep his shop alive. He became part of a team, designing wheelchairs and mobility aids for thousands of people across the country. He traveled to hospitals, met children whose eyes lit up when they received their first chair, and listened to veterans who regained independence because of the devices he helped refine. Each story fueled him, each grateful smile reminding him of Ryan and the spark that had started it all. Months turned into years, and Ethan's work began to leave a legacy. He was still the same humble man, still rolling up his sleeves and working with his hands, but his stage had grown far beyond the walls of his garage. Reporters wrote about him, calling him the mechanic who changed lives. Parents sent letters thanking him for his designs. Daniel often told colleagues he keeps this company's heart beating. Ethan never let the recognition go to his head. For him, it was still about people. Always about people. Sometimes, when he visited Sarah and Ryan, he would see the boy racing down the sidewalk, laughing, free in a way he hadn't been before. Sarah would stand on the porch, smiling at Ethan with the same gratitude as that first day in the shop, and each time Ethan realized that no matter how far he had come, his journey had started with one act of kindness, one repaired wheelchair, one promise to do the right thing, and because of that, countless lives were brighter.